So yeah, your new favorite Kotlin libraries. I'm Cas Plattel. I've been working at bol.com since 2016 as a software engineer, mostly in the financial corner of bol.com. And all our services we're using are in Kotlin, some written in Kotlin from scratch and some actually from Java converted to Kotlin. And we're actually using quite a lot of Kotlin libraries. And today I wanted to talk about some of the libraries we've been using, not the most popular ones you might know of, but more of the obscure ones or the lesser known ones, which add a lot of value, I think, for us at least as a team. I'll be talking about Expose. This is a database-related library. Kotlin Test, which, as the name suggests, is about testing. Some mocking libraries, a utility library we use for logging, ValidateCouture, which is a validation library, and KatyLint. So first up is Exposed. Exposed is a type-safe SQL wrapping DSL, which kind of sounds a bit vague, but it's somewhere in between an ORM like Hibernate and just plain JDBC templating. And we really like it because ORMs are a bit too much magic for us. But we also don't really like just writing plain SQL all the time. It supports the major database brands like Postgres, Oracle, that kind of stuff. And it's actually being developed by JetBrains, which is nice. It looks like this. So these are two examples of tables. You define them as objects in Kotlin, and for each of the tables you set the field values as representing your columns. So in this example, the users table has an ID, a name, and a city ID, and these are actually columns in your database. You give them the database column name, some type, stuff like primary key, nullability. You can actually do foreign key relations as well. In this case, the city ID refers to the cities table, which has an ID. And that's actually getting generated on database level with the auto increment. So it has all the usual SQL functionalities. In Expose, you can actually let it output the queries it uses under the hood. So it's actually just plain SQL, as you might expect. Now, if you were to insert data using Expose, it looks like this. So you can just do table name .insert or .select if you want to query, and give your parameters. In this case, we're inserting a city. And the nicety about Expose now is that the value inserting for the new row, in this case the name, is actually type checked during compile time. So you're actually inserting a string, which might seem a bit trivial in this case, but if you're doing a lot of joins and that kind of stuff, it's actually quite nice that at compile time you already know if your program is correct or not. Then we use getCities.id afterwards, so we get the identifier of the cities table generated by the database, and we can actually use it to insert a user, because it has a foreign key relation. And once again, it evaluates just in plain SQL queries under the hood. So that's pretty nice. Next up is Kotlin Test. This has been a bit of a search for us, finding a good testing library in Kotlin. Initially, we used Spec, but it was a bit limited in some regards, and we ended up using Kotlin Test. Kotlin Test is a library with its own DSL, and it supports many different so-called testing styles, which I'll elaborate a bit on in a minute. And it has a nice integration with Spring, so you can actually test your Spring stuff as well. So those testing styles. In Kotlin Test, you define your test class, extending a certain testing style, in this case, the more basic one called funspec. And you can just write it as a JUnit test, so you have a test keyword, a sentence describing your test, and then you just do your usual testing code. In this case, just some plain assertions. But there are more elaborate testing styles, for instance, the word spec, which you can do nested stuff. So instead of repeating all your tests all the time, you can actually define something and inside it have separate blocks testing different functionalities. Then there's feature specs, which is more, if you're familiar with Cucumber, this might ring a bell. You actually define a feature and describe different scenarios of those features, similar to the Gherkin files you might be familiar with. And this is the one we use quite extensively. This is the behavior spec. And the behavior spec, it's kind of similar like the Spock framework. So you describe the behavior of your units you want to test using a given when-then structure. And in the given block, you write down your assumptions, your basic stuff. In the when, you actually execute the method you want to, or function, I should say, in Kotlin, you want to test. And in the then block, you do your assertions. You can actually do parameterized input as well in Kotlin test. For us, we do this a lot in our team. Using the for all construction. In this example, for each of the rows in this for all, the test will be executed. So for instance, for row 2, 4, the root will be 2, the square will be 4, and we will assert if 2 times 2 equals 4. And this one you can actually use in all the different testing styles, which I've just shown. The Spring integration, this is actually pretty nice. You can just use your normal Spring context. You have to do a little bit of boilerplate, adding some sort of listener which listens to this context, and then you can just auto-wire beans into it and use those beans in your test as you would normally do. All right, mocking libraries in Kotlin. Mocking in Kotlin is historically pretty difficult, mainly because classes in Kotlin are final by default, and most Java mocking libraries, like the open classes structure Java has. So using stuff like Mockito is a bit limiting. Luckily, someone wrote a library on top of that called Mockito Kotlin, surprisingly, which is just a tiny layer on top of Mockito, which you can use Mockito in Kotlin. But it has some limitations. Not everything is fully supported, so partial mocking using Spice is not supported. Inline class is not. Initially, coroutines wasn't supported. Nowadays, I think it is. So there were a few limitations on it. It looks like this. So you just define your mock. You describe the behavior with the whenever. So inside the whenever, you have this method call, and you do dot then returns some sort of outcome. You call something, and you can actually verify if the mock is being called. Quite classic Mockito example. But due to the limitations, we actually went out and searched for different mocking libraries in Kotlin. We came across mock-k, which I would recommend if you're using Kotlin. It's built for Kotlin from scratch, and it actually is more feature-rich, so it supports all the stuff which Mockito Kotlin doesn't. It will require you to do a tiny migration because the syntax is slightly different. It looks like this. So same example, you have your mock, but instead of the whenever thing, you use the keyword every, and then you have a returns something. And as you can see, it's more idiomatic Kotlin, so there's not this object-oriented dot something, but you can just use infix functions, which is quite nice. You call the behavior and you will verify in similar fashion. Just like Mockito, all the features are there. So if you want to, for instance, assert if something is called twice, you can do times is 2, that kind of stuff. And if you want to use, or if you're using coroutines, you can actually mock this as well with, instead of every and verify, you can just do co-every and co-verify for your asynchronous functions. So that's pretty nice, I would say. Logging. So logging is maybe one of the examples in Kotlin where it's a bit more boilerplate and more complex than Java, surprisingly. And that's mainly because Kotlin doesn't have static in its language. So if you want to log in Kotlin, it would look something like this. If you want to have a static logger for a class, you would have to create a companion object, use refer to the class, which is being the logger is being used for, and then you have it. Of course, you could do it in a one-liner like this, but then you would instantiate a logger per each class instance, which is suboptimal. But luckily, we found a library which offers this, called microservices logging, where you can just copy-paste this line of code. And all your classes, you have a logger, one per, so like statically available, and you can just log your normal stuff, like .debug, .error, that kind of stuff. But of course, this is a bit of a pro-con, because you will include a library, so you have an additional dependency, which you save a little bit of boilerplate. So it's a trade-off. Okay, ValidateCouture. This is a library we use for validating our data classes. And it's actually quite powerful and quite nice. I'll just skip to the example. Let's say you have a data class called employee, and you want to make sure that some of these values or properties of the data class have certain constraints on them. For instance, the identifier of the employee always has to be positive. Then you can use ValidateCouture to actually validate these things, that upon construction of this data class, it will assert that all these things hold true. And if it's not, it will raise a legal argument exception, saying, hey, the ID is negative, for instance. All these things are provided by the library, so checking if something is an email address, that kind of stuff, which is pretty neat. But where it really shines is if you're using Spring, because you can actually have it include its own exception handler, and then whenever you do, for instance, in a REST controller, you do a post, and the validation fails, it will automatically map it to 422 HTTP error, and actually generate a nice error response for your end users, saying something like, for instance, in this example, let's say the ID is negative, you filled in -1, the message you will get from the endpoint will be, you filled in -1, we expect the identifier to be positive. And none of that is something you have to write yourself, it's all there out of the box. Last but not least is KatyLint. This is a tool we use for linting or Kotlin code, which I would recommend to prevent maybe potential code style discussions. Whenever you compile your code, it will automatically format everything, which is nice, according to the JetBrains coding style guidelines they've written for Kotlin. Now, of course, if you're a bit stubborn and you think, I might know better than JetBrains, it still allows for your own rule sets, so you can still extend it a bit, if you like. Now, of course, there are many more libraries out there, quite famously coroutines, which I briefly mentioned, but there are many, many more out there. I have hoped to inspire you a bit to try some of these libraries we've been using, and I would urge you to try out a lot of Kotlin libraries, because there's a lot of stuff out there. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. Any questions? Maybe.
Although you said that...
A microphone.
Thank you. Yes. Although you said that it signs with Spring, there are some parts or Kotlin libraries, some Kotlin libraries sign with Spring. For instance, the validate, there are some annotations in Spring that you can do the same.
Yeah.
So which one would you prefer to use?
Well, what I would prefer
with
to
your
use...
experience.
So I get what you mean. I think like on exception level, you can set which HTTP code it would respond to. That's nice. I think the nicety about ValidateCouture is that it actually already also includes a message in the body of the response, so which will kind of explain to your end user why the HTTP call is failing. So normally you put an annotation on your class, and with this one you actually out of the box already the whole thing is generated, and you don't have to really worry about which HTTP codes, which messages, like which of the 3 constraints is it actually not? Are you how do you say it? Not valid? Is not valid? So it's a bit more feature rich, I guess.
One more question before lunch.
So in those messages that you can send back, can you internationalize them?
Can you?
Internationalize them. So
Internationalize them. Ooh, I do think they have support for that, actually. Yeah, I would have to check, but I think ValidateCouture does support internationalization.
Okay, that was a fast one. One more, or time for food? Well, let's thank Cas one more time.